Welcome to the podcast of Mann Library's Chats in the Stacks Book Talk series. In today's talk, originally presented at Mann Library on June 9, 2006, herpetologist and professor of neurobiology and behavior Kraig Adler discusses the possible causes and implications of the decline in global amphibian populations. The lecture puts a special focus on one protected natural area being stewarded by the Cornell Plantations, the Ringwood Nature Preserve, which harbors a diverse mix of animal and plant life and becomes a teeming breeding ground for salamanders, peepers, and other amphibians each spring. Careful conservation measures at the preserve, including a toad tunnel constructed to guide frogs, toads, and salamanders under a heavily trafficked road skirting the preserve, are helping to protect this important habitat for local amphibians and suggest the power of think global, act local analysis, advocacy, and action on behalf of the environment.
I do see some of my former students, and that's always a pleasure to see that there's life after introductory biology. I see several people here who live on Ringwood Road, and there are many people in the audience here who, if I get stuck in the Q&A at the end, could answer the questions better than I could. So I won't name you, but it's quite a pleasure to speak before this group. I want to talk, and also I should add, especially to the alumni who are here. I've met quite a number in the last couple of days, and I've always enjoyed participating in these events and get to meet more alumni year after year. I want to talk about a group of animals that are very special to me, and I hope it comes through by the end of the talk how special they really are to me. I've been fascinated in them since I was a kid, and it was only when I went to college and then to graduate school that I understood that these organisms are particularly good models for doing ecological or behavioral or evolutionary kinds of research. But as you probably know from the mass media, amphibians are in peril worldwide. And so, this is the kind of beast that I work on. A tiger salamander, not native to Ithaca, but I've worked with them in years past. I want to use this old conservation motto as an organizing theme for my talk. I want to talk about the worldwide and then national situation first. And then we're going to talk more specifically about the local situation, and here is the pond at Ringwood nearest the road, Ringwood Road. The problem is simply this: amphibians are declining, not only in numbers of individuals in populations, but more seriously, they're going extinct. The first recognition of this problem was rather recently, in 1989, when there was a World Congress and people came together and suddenly realized what each of them thought was just a local problem turned out to be repeated in many parts of the world. And it seemed to be a global issue. But in fact, those people then spent the better part of a decade debating whether these declines and even extinctions were real or whether they were just part of the natural cycles in which many amphibians and many other kinds of animals go through. You know, the lynx and hare cycles and all of the other kinds of cycles, predator-prey cycles. And so it took a better part of a decade for us to convince ourselves that these indeed were real. And as a result, with some federal funding, the Global Amphibian Assessment took place on a worldwide basis. This involved hundreds and hundreds of people in virtually every country around the world, biologists, in most cases specifically amphibian biologists, who were asked to go out according to a very standardized protocol and make observations to find out whether the amphibians there were also suffering from decline. As a result of that, we now know that some 32% of the species of amphibians in the world are threatened with extinction, a third of the species. In the U.S., that number is about 17%, but that's small comfort. We don't have that many amphibians here to start with compared to the tropics. There's one locality in Costa Rica where just in a few years in the late 80s, 40% of all the species in that habitat disappeared completely. It's a global problem. I've listed many of the places where the declines have taken place, and there are others. The big surprise was that species are disappearing even in pristine, protected environments. We thought that by protecting enough kinds of habitats, tropical forests, deserts, swamplands, etc., that if we protected enough of those in enough places, that the animals that live there would be protected. In fact, even in some national parks that are very strongly protected from collecting or any other kinds of assaults, species have disappeared and in fact gone extinct, in Costa Rica in particular. Well, the question I would like to raise is, why should we care whether this is happening at all? And I'd like to submit that there are many reasons. I've listed 5 major reasons here why we should all care whether amphibians disappear or not. First of all, we've known for a long, long time that amphibians are involved in eating insects, often insects that are noxious pests or insects such as mosquitoes that carry disease that are important to us. In fact, in many cases, amphibians that feed on mosquitoes or sugarcane beetles are taken other places in order to control them in those places, which sometimes creates other kinds of problems. The second reason we should care is that amphibians, salamanders, frogs, and toads, are key elements of food webs. They are involved in eating very, very small prey. Here we see a salamander eating an earthworm, but most of the prey they eat are so small that you'd have to get down on the ground with your hands and knees and look for it. Little tiny insects and other kinds of arthropods. So amphibians eat these very, very tiny prey, and then they themselves become prey for larger organisms, birds and mammals. And therefore they are a very critical link in these food webs. We don't realize how abundant these animals are. In the case of the redback salamander, which you see here in the lower panel, the 2 phases of the redback salamander, this is extremely abundant. In fact, a number of studies have shown in eastern woodlands that the total biomass of all redback salamanders in a given forest is equal to more than all of the birds and mammals living in that forest. Now think about that for a minute. That's a pretty good amount of biomass. That's how abundant these animals are. The fact is, you see only a tiny part of the population on the surface of the ground. They're in burrows. They're often very deep down in the ground. And when you do the right kind of analyses, Lincoln Index and other kinds of technology, or technique rather, in order to determine the abundances, they turn out to be incredibly abundant. Here's another reason: human medicine. The skin of most of these amphibians is essentially a pharmaceutical factory. It produces various kinds of compounds, alkaloids, peptides, other kinds of compounds, which are important for protecting that animal from predation, but which have a structure which turns out to be very useful for humans. 3 examples. Here's a little frog you see acrobatically climbing on a twig. The secretions from its back are cardiac stimulants for heart attack patients. It produces what is referred to as pumiliotoxin in the trade, and it's actually now synthetically produced and is used for human medicine. Here's another one that blocks pain receptors. If you look on the top of this bottle in this ad for a synthetic form of the toxins which this frog produces by itself, this is called epibadidine. It's a synthetic material, and it blocks pain receptors. It is some 200 times more potent than morphine, but it does not have the side effects. It doesn't have addictive or sedative side effects. And finally, this rather strange-looking frog, which is the clawed frog from southern Africa. This is a fully aquatic frog, and in its back it has a substance which we have called meganins. It is a very powerful antimicrobial. It kills bacteria, viruses, protozoa, fungi, and even certain kinds of cancer cells. And in fact, there's a company in this country that is now dedicated to producing this synthetically. Here's another reason why amphibians are important. They are indicators of the health of our environment. They are exceedingly sensitive to pollutants in the environment, especially an aquatic environment in which they live. And if the pollutants are there, it causes various developmental effects, developmental abnormalities, often causing the death of the embryo. Two examples, the herbicide atrazine, we know from studies that have been done at Berkeley, strongly affects the development of amphibians, even when it's in a few parts per billion in the water. Another is Prozac. We all know Prozac, right? Both of these are in our water that we drink in very tiny quantities. But to amphibians, even those small quantities have a demonstrable effect on their development. And finally, I would suggest that amphibians have aesthetic and symbolic value. They have to ancient cultures. I mean, the Egyptians, they recognized, they saw the linkage between the appearances of frogs in the spring and the fields becoming fertile. And this was a symbol of fertility. There were even, you remember the ancient Egyptians had not one but multiple gods. Well, some of these gods, Peter, had the head of a frog. Wonderful. The Zunis in New Mexico, their water holding bowls have tadpole decorations on them. The Mayans of Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, for millennia and even yet today, they have rain dances. And in the rain dances, they actually evoke some of the calls of the frogs that live in that area. I will spare you the calls. Some of the calls of the rhinophrynis are really some of the most disgusting frogs I've ever heard. But it's a sign of spring. It sounds like somebody throwing up. And they call the frog the uo. And if you think of the sound you make, uo, you know, well, anyway, you get the idea. Okay. So, you know, where would we be without frogs? I mean, this is a sign of spring. As much as the birds calling, the frogs calling in the marshes, where would a girl find her prince without a frog, right? What are the causes of decline? I'm going to talk about 6 of them that have been implicated in these last few years. And you'll notice I put some asterisks. The major one is changes in land use. And we're going to be talking about that because that's the major one involving Ringwood ponds. These are of lesser importance, especially in North America. And here's one that's a rather recent entrant. And you'll see why. This was an important paper that was published in Nature just a few months ago. Land use. Well, here's a picture of Ringwood. Here's Ringwood Road. Here the ponds start on the left, and here are the woodlands where these animals spend the winter and the rest of the year. They hibernate there, they feed, they reproduce there, but they lay their eggs over on this side of the road. Obviously, the road is a serious hazard, and we're going to be talking about that in more detail. The road, in other words, interrupts the 2 places that they have to spend part of their year. The uplands where they spend most of it, and the lowlands where they actually lay their eggs. So it could be interruption, it could be destruction, it could be just fragmentation, where the land is so fragmented that the population sizes get so small that for reproductive purposes they aren't large enough to sustain a population. Chemical pollution, also an important one in North America. You've all heard about acid rain. Well, this happens to have rather severe effects on amphibians. You know about the smokestack industries in the Midwest. Those then get into the atmosphere, and they then are precipitated to the earth and into waterways in upstate New York. And in fact, there are ponds in upstate New York which once had salamanders and frogs, and they are now totally devoid of all amphibians. Fortunately, in the Ithaca area, our amphibian populations are in very good condition. people here care about their environment and they protect the environment more than some others. But we also are not subjected to some of the massive insults that other places are. Agricultural runoff is another serious problem for amphibians. Disease organisms. This is one, if you've read in USA Today and other magazines, this chytrid fungus, which can grow on the skins of amphibians, has been implicated in the last few years in amphibian declines. Now, I should, as an aside, remind you how important the skin is to an amphibian. This is an accessory respiratory structure. This is like having an extra pair of lungs. If it's moist, it has to be moist for the gases, oxygen, to go into solution, and then they can diffuse across the skin into the capillaries. And likewise, carbon dioxide can be released. Some of these animals, like the red-backed salamanders, actually have no lungs. So the skin is exceedingly important for their survival. And yet here is a fungus that lives on the skin. And this is a cross-section through the skin of a salamander from New Mexico. And if you look very closely, you'll see this circular structure with some black dots. This is the reproductive structure of these fungi, which then burst out of these structures and grow on the skin of these amphibians and kill them. And many of them, I've seen pictures of these, they're eerie pictures. It's not an animal that looks decomposed. It's like an animal that's been moving along and suddenly it just can't go any further. And it's like somebody made a mold, a cast of it for a museum display. And the animal's stopped in mid-motion and has this fungus growing on them. Trematodes, parasites, also have an effect. If the trematode deposits its reproductive structures in the tadpoles, count the hind legs on this frog. Now, this is not actually a skeleton. This has been stained in a particular way that allow you to see what the skeleton looks like actually through the skin, which becomes clear. And so if you count the legs, I count 6, the hind legs. And this frog will not survive very long. It doesn't locomote properly. It falls prey to raccoons much faster than it would otherwise. It interferes, these trematodes interfere with the development in these animals. Ultraviolet radiation. This is one that, as far as we're concerned here in North America, is not so much of a threat, but in some other parts of the world it is. By the way, these are amphibians. This is the third major group of amphibians. This is sort of a little bit of introductory biology here, right? You have your frogs and toads, you have your salamanders and newts, and everybody knows those amphibians. These are caecilians. This is the third group. They're eel-like. Most of them are on land, but in burrows. And they actually have a little tentacle, protrusible tentacle between the nostril and the eye, and some other rather peculiar features. Well, the ultraviolet radiation is present, of course, but we're protected from most of it because of the ozone layer. But where there are holes in the ozone, then the ultraviolet light increases, and we know that this causes a number of effects, in particular the breakage of the DNA molecules, which in turn cause developmental effects. Here's another cause for decline. That is the introduction, accidentally or purposefully, of invasive species. Sometimes they're other amphibians, like this big marine or cane toad. If you look very closely, you'll see that the feet of its prey are sticking out of its mouth. This is a voracious predator. It was introduced in Australia to, in fact, control beetles. But it turned out that it liked to eat frogs and just about everything else that it could get into its mouth. It's now become an enormous pest and has, it is believed, caused the extinction of a number of species, especially in northeastern Australia. And finally, global warming. Now, this is not a political speech here. We're just going to talk about some of the observations that have been made and the data gathered that indicate that the average temperatures on our globe have been increasing rather faster than they have been in the past. And so a large group of scientists, about 15, decided to do a study on a group of frogs that live in the neotropics. And it's this frog here. This is one of the species of harlequin frogs. It's a toad relative. It's in the family Bufonidae, but it's the genus Atelopus. And there are well over 100 species, or I should say, correctly, there were over 100 species. Now about 2/3 of them are extinct. And they thought, since they had a lot of data on these frogs, they knew when the last specimens were seen of these particular frogs in various places. And they wanted to see what correlation there was with global warming. And so if you look at this graph, this is the only graph I'm going to show you this morning, what they decided to do was to look at the species that were observed for the last time following a particular year, which was a warm year. Most of them were warm. Some were much warmer than others. And if you look at the lower axis here, this is the AT, or air temperature, for a particular locality. And these numbers are the deviation from the running mean of the previous 30 years. And you'll see that all of these are plus degrees centigrade. So the temperature has gone up. But notice here it's 1/4 of a degree, here it's over 1/2 a degree. And you'll notice that the number of extinctions increased with the increase in temperature from the baseline. Now this is from a paper. This is just one of many, many lines of evidence that were presented in a paper, the senior author of which is Alan Pounds. There were 15 other authors. It was in Nature in January. I put a question mark here because they're making a hypothesis. They have some data, and now it's open to further testing by other people. But their data looks pretty convincing. And what's the mechanism? How does global warming cause these animals to become extinct? Well, now we begin to see how several of these factors might be linked. In this case, it turns out that the chytrid fungus, its growth is promoted at higher temperatures. And so we have the proximate cause, the chytrids, but the ultimate cause, they believe, Pounds et al. Believe, is the increase in temperature. Now I'm going to switch to the local scene. But first I want to give a little background, a little bit about amphibian migration that I think will be important to understanding what I'm going to say later. First of all, most amphibians, when they are sexually mature and are reproducing, and they go back to a reproductive area, whether it's a stream or a pond or a lake, most of our evidence suggests in a wide range of species they go back to the pond in which they were hatched, in which they spent their childhood, if you will. And how they remember it, we have all sorts of ideas and even some data. But they go back, we know from marking studies, they go back to their natal ponds. And that might be many miles. And of course the terrain might have changed quite a bit since they became sexually mature. The little red F that you see on land is the land stage of the red-spotted newt. They hatch out in the water, they're larvae, then they metamorphose the first time into the F, which goes out on the land for some 3 to 7 years, and they wander around. I don't think they're actually wandering, I think they're memorizing the landscape, the magnetic and other aspects of the landscape. And then when they become sexually mature, they metamorphose a second time and they go back to their natal pond. Then they continue to use that same route year after year. Now here's an aerial photo. This is a study that was done in California with salamanders that live along this little stretch of stream here. And the salamanders, particular individuals that are marked, only live in that section number 2, and others only live in section 19. Year after year, they have great site fidelity. Well, those animals then migrate to other places, but then they return to those streams year after year after year. And they find them, we know in this particular case, largely by using a sense of smell, because you can take a very crude experiment, but very demonstrative. You take sponges and you put them in a bucket with these animals and get the smell of these animals, and you put them on different rocks, and they only go to the rocks that have the smell of their species. Actually, of those individuals, I should say. They use the same route year after year. And therefore, if a road intersects that route, they're going to have that same hazard year after year after year. In fact, twice a year, right? Going in and coming out. The other thing you need to know is that many of these amphibians live to be very old. You would think that small animals, like these small salamanders, you would generally think they live short lives. And many animals that small live short lives, but not these salamanders. Many of these salamanders don't even become sexually mature until they're 5 or 8 years old. In the case of the newt I just mentioned, 3 to 7 years. As an eft, 7 years later, some of them, they become sexually mature. And then they reproduce for many years after that. Many of these amphibians will live 20, 30. There are some amphibians we know in captivity at least can live 40 and 50 years. So they're going to be exposed, if they're still reproductively active, they're going to be exposed to these hazards for a long time. And we know they're using a variety of guidance mechanisms. This is an area in which I've done research with my students over many years. We know they use the sun cue, stars, they use polarized light patterns in the sky, they use the Earth's magnetic field, sounds, frogs, of course, are using sounds in particular, odors, landmarks, etc. And many species use a combination of these cues. Well, as I said, the major problem for many of the migrants in the Ithaca area, in North America and in developed countries, are roads. And they have to cross those roads. Well, you can call out the toad patrol, and you know, kids like to do this. They feel like they're doing something for conservation, and they are. And it's a nice learning situation for students, but it's rather ephemeral and rather labor-intensive to do that, to say nothing of the potential danger of the kids being out on the road at night. Another problem is that most amphibians are annoyed by very bright lights. And, of course, car headlights are such, and it causes them to freeze in place. And so rather than hurrying across the road, they do just the opposite. And they freeze, and they'll sit there for quite a long time, making their trek across the road twice or 3 or 4 times as long as it would otherwise have been if the car hadn't gone past. We know in the Ithaca area from some preliminary data that mortality on a given night can be as much as 15 to 25% of the population. You estimate how many animals are going across the night at night, and then you look at the carcasses there of the animals that didn't make it, and you do some simple calculations. Well, now with the fence that's been put up at Ringwood, they're going to be able to be much more quantitative about this. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. Well, one solution to this problem of not needing the toad patrol is to have tunnels under the road. And this is something that was pioneered in England 10 or 15 years ago, and then it came to Massachusetts, and it's come to other parts of the world, where animals then simply pass under the road, and then fences are erected. I'll show you some pictures, some plastic fences to help sort of gather the salamanders and frogs and direct them towards that tunnel and increase the chances that they'll go under the road rather than on top of the road. And of course, they use the tunnel in both directions. And here are a couple of pictures from the Ringwood Preserve. This is 6 or 7 miles east of the campus here. The fences, which you can see here you can see a fence. The actual tunnel under the road starts right about here in the lower left corner. And here you see this long plastic fence which snakes through the woods. The fence is about this high. It's quite large. And it isn't straight up. As you can see, it has a heavy lip to it. So frogs can't just get to the fence and hop over it. They'll hop up into the fence, and eventually the idea is they hop here, or the salamanders crawl here, and then they simply move along the fence and are directed to, in this case, you can see the tunnel under the road is right there. The fence is made of plastic. It's quite sturdy. The only thing that occasionally happens is a tree falls on it, and then you have to take that section out and replace it with another one. The cost was relatively low in this case because there was an existing culvert under the road. They didn't have to dig up the road. So the cost of installing all of this plastic fencing, and of course it has to be installed on both sides of the road, right? Because they've got to come back. And so they have to be herded to the tunnel on the return trip. About $4,000 in this case. And there's a company that actually sells these pieces of plastic for just this purpose, because these are being erected in many places now. And it's low maintenance. It's plastic, and except, as I said, for a tree falling directly on it, it's quite durable. You do have to put a light in the tunnel. It's been discovered that having a little light in the tunnel encourages, just a small light in the tunnel, encourages them to go through it. And so you have to change the batteries once a year. And they have to come out because these animals are anxious to get to the ponds in the spring, and there's still a lot of snow. As if you've been out in the early spring before the snow's gone, the amphibians are already on their way. Sometimes you're too late, and they're already in the ponds breeding. Well, you have to unclog the ends of the tunnels, and you have to get the snow out of the way. So those are the two major annual maintenance things that have to be done: the batteries and the snow, and then occasionally fixing a section that's been damaged by a falling tree. A couple of problems. The fences, of course, have an end somewhere. They don't go on forever, and some animals do slip around the ends of the fence. The other problem, of course, is we don't have enough of these installed in enough places, and so many of them are now simply killed on the roads. But at least here is something that can be done to mitigate the massive killings of these amphibians as they're heading to the ponds for reproduction in the spring and then heading back up into the forest for the rest of the year. So here's something that we can do to mitigate one of the factors that causes declines. The very factor that we believe in North America, at least, is the most important of the 6 that I pointed out to you this morning. So I think I'll stop at that point and ask if there are any questions. I will do my best. Thank you.